Welcome to the Church Resource, where we talk about the best resources for pastors, leaders, and lay people. I'm your host, Jeff Oliver. Today we're looking at a book that has helped me immensely in both personal life and in counseling, and this is called Uprooting Anger. It is by Robert Jones. I need to tell you also that this was one of my textbooks in seminary. I took the class from Robert Jones, who avoids being called Bob Jones to avoid any kind of mix up with Bob Jones University, but this is not the same guy. So the book is Uprooting Anger, Biblical Help for a Common Problem. And Dr. Jones here does a wonderful job of explaining anger, understanding its root causes, and really delineating it, completely separating it from what the world would say about what anger is and what are some of the commonly held misconceptions about anger, where it comes from and how to fix it, what some of the sources of anger are, and even clears up some of the biblical misunderstandings of anger. Let's get into the book a little bit, and I want to tell you about this as we go. So he talks about this problem of anger. Starts out the first chapter with what is anger, and well defines it here. This book is full of scripture. This is one of those that comes from the school of what I would call true biblical counseling, and not simply Christian counseling, which sometimes is just worldly, secular counseling with a few Bible verses added on. This is not that. This is very biblical. He starts out from the beginning, talking about both some biblical examples and some Bible verses that relate to the subject of anger and how we ought to act in the world, but then also some real life examples that come from his own counseling, that come from stories he knows about and people who have dealt with their anger issues. So this is at the same time very biblical and very practical. Not that those two have to be held apart from each other. The Bible is very practical, and Dr. Jones helps us to see how the Bible actually speaks to this quite a bit, to this subject, and how we ought to behave ourselves in dealing with other people in interpersonal relationships. So he goes through the ideas of anger and what it is about. He talks about the biblical categories of anger, all of the synonyms that are used in the Bible for anger, and that many times, that really the only times that it is presented as a good thing is when we see it come from God, because God can do something in ways that we cannot, and in being perfect, He can do something that if we would try to do it, in for example, to have righteous anger, so-called, it's almost impossible for humans to do it, but God does it very well, and we see that that example that Jesus is a part of, that where he's turning over tables in the temple, and people always kind of mention that one as, well, Jesus had anger. Yes, he did, but he could do something in such a way that would be done perfectly and be done without sinning. So that's an example that's often brought up. As Dr. Jones proceeds through the book here, I want to point out to you that this has something in it that I'd love to point out to you in a book that is a section at the end of each chapter, almost each chapter. I think there are a few that don't have this, but it says it's a section called For Further Reflection and Life Application. And so he has you work through some examples, looking up the words anger and rage and wrath in the concordances and wherever they appear in the Bible, to get an idea, to get a full image, so that we look at the whole counsel of God, and not just kind of pick and choose some of the favorite verses that are on these topics, but we can get a full theology of what anger looks like as it's presented in the Bible. And then he has you reflect more deeply on some of the sentences, some of the paragraphs that are pulled out and quoted from other authors. He does that, and then asks some more pointed questions in that, and then has you point out in this particular example. So jot down a typical anger episode in your life, and then work through that and process some of that as you apply what you have just read in this chapter about what is anger. So that's a way that Dr. Jones has you work through the material and has you help yourself to get a deeper understanding of what anger is. And one other that I want to point out here is in the 3rd chapter, getting to the heart of anger, is that he gives an example, an illustration here, and carries that illustration throughout really most of the rest of the book. But one of the points that I wanted to bring up is that he gives in a little box off to the side and then explains it later fully in the chapter. But there is a box here called Our Culture's Theories About the Causes of Anger. They would be things like inner unconscious psychodynamic forces, childhood trauma, present sufferings, unmet emotional needs, physiological factors, satanic attacks. Most of those, if we hear them, we think, well, that makes sense, and this is what I've always heard. Dr. Jones talks about those things, but he's not dismissive of all of those, but he does help us to understand that at the root, as with most books that deal with true biblical counseling, we're going to look at how is this problem, this issue that we're talking about, how's this related to the heart, and what is my responsibility in this in order to present myself in a proper way and to avoid sin, but to do the right thing in these situations that I find myself in. No matter what the other underlying factors or causes might be, I'm responsible for my own response to these things, and this is how we need to approach every issue in life, but especially as he talks about here in the topic of anger. And then he gets to another similar box later in the chapter and talks about the heart causes of anger. And he pulls that right out of James chapter 4. We would expect that in a biblical counseling book, that we're going to look at not just one verse, not cherry picking, but we're looking at a section, a portion of Scripture that is going to give us the kind of the outline of what we're talking about here on, in this case, the topic of anger. So he talks about in James chapter 4, we have unmet desires, unmet ruling wants and desires in our hearts, in our minds, coveting and envy, selfish motives. And if you look at James chapter 4, that comes right out of the passage. So very well done, I think. And, I have studied this book well. Again, I mentioned it was part of a class, so I probably answered test questions on it. I probably wrote a paper on it at some point. And again, having Dr. Jones there to help us to understand the principles and to pull out some of the arguments there in the book was very helpful. And I know that the same person, what you see here in the book, is very conversational, and is the same person who is writing the book is the one who taught me the material in person, and is very consistent. And it comes from a real heart of wanting to help people change and help people to do the right thing as it relates to what is presented in the Bible. So I also know, having known the author here, it helps me to know that this material is valuable, it's practical, and is presented with the best motives, the best intentions in mind. He has a chapter here on helping others deal with their anger. So this moves from making it a kind of a study of what anger is and some of the causes and even responses of that. But then how do we, maybe now that we've understood the issue better, how do we then move that into helping someone else to deal with it? In other words, from it helping my heart to helping counsel now someone else as they deal with it. And he gently, graciously helps us to unpack that, understand how to help someone else who is in a situation like this where they're dealing with an anger problem. Dr. Jones then ends the book with, as we would expect, again, from biblical counselors, sample growth and application assignments in the appendices. And he has you journaling, he has you really pull out the truths out of James chapter 4, again, as he has done throughout the book, but then also to do some of your own work and do the legwork there of working through James chapter 4, looking at God's forgiveness of his people, and then how to, the next sample growth assignment is to battle bitterness with the gospel. So how do we do that? And how do we do that in a way that's honoring to God? Dr. Jones has one other section in here that I mentioned briefly a moment ago, but it's reconsidering two anger texts, and these are things that people have understood and pulled out of Scripture that are common misconceptions about anger. I won't spoil those for you. I'll let you read the book. But this is one that definitely needs to be part of your library, not just one and done where you read it and put it aside. I think this is one that you can go back to many times and prepare yourself if you're going to speak to someone who is dealing with anger. It's one that you can pull chapters out of and recommend those for people, even giving the book to them to help them to understand their anger issue. I think it's a good one to keep in mind here. This is called Uprooting Anger, Biblical Help for a Common Problem by Robert D. Jones, and I highly recommend it. This is one book for my shelves that has been very helpful to me in my ministry, and I hope it gives you a bit of direction as you prayerfully consider which resources will best help you and the people you minister to. Thanks for listening to The Church Resource. Please make sure that you give us a review, and if you have any suggestions or resources that you would like us to look at, email us at thechurchresource@gmail.com. That's thechurchresource@gmail.com.